Of Anger by Seneca the Elder, starting in Book 7. May it not be that although anger be not natural to man, it may be right to adopt it because it often proves useful? It rouses the spirit and excites it, and courage does nothing grand in war without it, unless its flame be supplied from the source. This is the goad which stirs up bold men and sends them to encounter perils. Some therefore consider it to be best to control anger, not to banish it utterly, but to cut off its extravagances, and force anger to keep within useful bounds so as to retain that part of it without which action will become languid, and all strength and activity of mind will die away. In the first place, it is easier to banish dangerous passions than to rule them. It is easier not to admit them than to keep them in order when admitted. But when they have established themselves in possession of the mind, they are more powerful than the lawful ruler, and will in no wise permit themselves to be weakened or abridged. In the next place, reason herself, who holds the reins, is only strong while she remains apart from the passions. If she mixes and befouls herself with them, she becomes no longer able to restrain those whom she might once have cleared out of her path. For the mind, when once excited and shaken up, goes whither the passions drive it. There are certain things whose beginnings lie in our own power, but which, when developed, drag us along by their own force and leave us no retreat. Those who have flung themselves over a precipice have no control over their movements, nor can they stop or slacken their pace when once started, for their own headlong and irremediable rashness has left no room for either reflection or remorse, and they cannot help going to lengths which they might have avoided. So also the mind, when it has abandoned itself to anger, to love, or any other passion, is unable to check itself. Its own weight and the downward tendency of vices must needs carry the man off and hurl him into the lowest depth. Book 8. The best plan is to reject straight away the first incentives to anger, to resist its very beginnings, and to take care not to be betrayed into it. For at once it begins to carry us away, it is hard to get back again into a healthy condition. Because reason goes for nothing when one's passion has been admitted to the mind, and has by our own free will been given a certain authority. It will for the future do as much as it chooses, not only as much as you will allow it. The enemy, I repeat, must be met and driven back at the outermost frontier line. For when he has once entered the city and passed its gates, he will not allow his prisoners to set bounds to his victory. The mind does not stand apart and view its passions from without, so as not to permit them to advance further than they ought, but it is itself changed into a passion, and is therefore unable to check what once was useful and wholesome strength. Now it has become degenerate and misapplied, for passion and reason, as I have said before, have not distinct and separate provinces, but consist of the changes of the mind itself, for better or for worse. How then can reason recover itself when it is conquered and held down by vices, when it has given way to anger? Or how can it extricate itself from a confused mixture, the greater part of which consists of the lower qualities? But, argues our adversary, when some men, when in anger control themselves. Do they so far control themselves that they do nothing which anger dictates, or somewhat? If they do nothing thereof, it becomes evident that anger is not essential to the conduct of affairs, although your sect advocate it as possessing greater strength than reason. Finally, I ask, is anger stronger or weaker than reason? If stronger, how can reason impose any check upon it, since it is only less powerful than to obey? If weaker, then reason is competent to effect its ends without anger, and does not need the help of a less powerful quality. But some angry men remain consistent and control themselves. When do they do so? It is when their anger is disappearing and leaving them of its own accord, not when it was red hot, for then it was more powerful than they. What then? Do men, even in the height of their anger, sometimes let their enemies go whole and unhurt, and refrain from injuring them? They do, but when do they do so? It is when one passion overpowers another, and either fear or greed gets the upper hand for a while. On such occasions, it is not thanks to reason that anger is stilled, but owing to an untrustworthy and fleeting truce between the passions. In the next place, anger has nothing useful in itself, and does not rouse up to the mind the warlike deeds, for a virtue, being self-sufficient, never needs the assistance of a vice. Whenever it needs an impetuous effort, it does not become angry, but rises to the occasion, and excites or soothes itself as far as it deems requisite, such as the machines which hurl darts may be twisted to a greater or lesser degree of tension at the manager's pleasure. Anger, says Aristotle, is necessary, nor can any fight be won without it, unless it fills the mind and kindles up the spirit. It must, however, be made use of, not as a general, but as a soldier. Now this is untrue, for it listens to reason, and follows whither reason leads. It is no longer anger whose characteristic is obstinacy, if again it is disobedient, and will not be quiet when ordered, but is carried away by its own willful and headstrong spirit. It is then as useless an aid to the mind as a soldier who disregards the sounding of the treat would be to a general. If therefore anger allows limits to be imposed upon it, it must be called by some other name, and ceases to be anger, which I understand to be unbridled and unmanageable. And if it does not allow limits to be imposed upon it, it is harmful and not to be counted among aids. Wherefore either anger is not anger, or is useless. For if any man demands the infliction of punishment, not because he is eager for the punishment itself, but because it is right to inflict it, he ought not to be counted as an angry man. That will be the useful soldier, who knows how to obey orders. The passions cannot obey any more than they can command.